The highway stretched empty beneath a weak crescent moon, its painted lines fractured by years of heat and neglect. At 2:14 a.m., a radio crackled into static, the last recorded sound from Unit 117 as it slowed to investigate a lone sedan stranded by Carter Bridge. The vehicle's hazard lights blinked, an indifferent rhythm against the guardrail, each pulse illuminating the rain-slick concrete and the silhouettes of Deputies Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega stepping into the dark. Their boots struck the shoulder gravel, radios clipped at their shirts, flashlights alive in their hands. A routine stop, the kind that should end with a report and a tow, but then silence. The dash camera, after capturing 38 seconds of headlights and the shape of a driver's door left ajar, cut to static, and by dawn, both men were gone. The cruiser vanished with them. The official logbook froze on that entry, a date stamped and underlined. The 28th of March, 1998. 2 deputies dispatched, 2 men erased. 25 years later, earth movers cut through clay soil near mile marker 314. Their steel jaws hit something harder than dirt, something curved and hollow, a buried vehicle. And when investigators brushed away the soil, the faded paint and twisted metal of Unit 117 emerged, sealed inside the ground like a coffin. What lay within forced an entire county to reopen wounds they had tried to bury. Stay with us, because this story reaches from a night in 1998 to secrets kept alive by silence, and you will want to hear where it leads. Subscribe if you want to follow these cases into the dark. The first reports called it a disappearance. Officers Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, partners on the late shift, were simply missing in the line of duty. Their patrol car, also gone, was listed as stolen property. The narrative that spun in the weeks afterwards suggested they ran either from enemies or debts, or from something worse. Rumors fed the silences that lingered. Some said Vega had gambling ties. Others whispered Mercer had crossed a line with the wrong crowd. But families knew better. Mercer left behind a wife and 2 children. Vega left behind his mother, who still kept his badge photo on her nightstand. Both men had made promises to return. A single mother lost her son, a wife lost her husband, and a community lost faith in its guardians. Every year the anniversary passed like a ghost at Carter Bridge. Bouquets tied to guardrails, candles flickering until the wind took them. In 2003, 5 years later, the sheriff's office declared the case cold. Without a vehicle, without remains, there was nothing to pin down but rumor. Files were boxed, stacked in the archive room, and tagged with numbers that would gather dust. But silence does not erase, it only delays. And in 2023, when the backhoe bucket struck steel, the silence broke. Detective Sarah Collings was first to arrive at the excavation. Young but already marked by the patience required for cold cases, she stood on the clay bank while crews pulled Unit 117 from the ground. The windshield shattered inward, glass clinging to mud, the light bar bent in half. On the dashboard, an old clipboard fused with damp paper, its ink blurred to blue stains. The trunk, when forced open, held not bodies but waterlogged gear, road flares, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with the initials LV scratched into its base. That flashlight, wrapped and tagged, became the first undeniable artifact tying the car to Luis Vega. It was not just the car that returned. Within days, the excavation site became a pilgrimage. Retired officers drove down from other counties, old partners and rivals alike. Families arrived and stood behind tape, their eyes fixed on a piece of their past unearthed. Reporters gathered, microphones bristling. And in the middle of that storm, Collings asked the question no one could easily answer. Who buried a patrol car 6 feet deep at mile marker 314? And why did they wait 25 years to find it? Theories flared again, sharper this time because evidence had shifted. If Mercer and Vega had staged their own disappearance, why sink the vehicle? If criminals had struck them down, How had a cover-up succeeded this long? Collings pressed for records, and inside the sheriff's archive, she found a memo stamped containment. Dated the 1st of April 1998, it instructed staff to halt active search operations. The sheriff at the time, Harland, signed the order. He would later retire under clouds of suspicion, but the paper trail survived. Artifacts became Collings's map, the flashlight with Vega's initials, a torn scrap of uniform fabric dredged from the river below Carter Bridge, tagged and forgotten in evidence. And then, in a steel drum hidden in a salvage yard, Mercer's badge. Each object unearthed more questions. The badge was pitted and blackened as if from fire, but its number was legible. And carved inside the drum's lid, a message. We didn't run. They buried us. These discoveries did more than stir memory. They drew out voices. A retired sergeant, Carnes, broke silence to tell Collings that Harland's office had received anonymous warnings in 1998 to stop digging near Carter Bridge. A woman who worked nights at a diner remembered seeing Mercer and Vega walk in that March evening, their uniforms damp from rain, both looking uneasy. They left before ordering food, but one left behind a receipt folded twice. Collings unfolded it a quarter-century later. The timestamp read 22A. From there, the investigation widened. And with every widening came shadows. Because alongside the names of deputies and sergeants came another. A fixer, whispered in law enforcement circles, known only as Charlie K.S. K.S. was short for a surname no one wanted to pronounce on record. He owned the salvage yard where the drum was found, ran shell properties across the county, and moved quietly between the lines of legality and threat. His presence loomed like static on a radio. You didn't hear his name. You felt it interrupt transmissions. Collings pressed forward, but resistance thickened. Files went missing. Calls came at night. Anonymous voices told her to walk away. She did not. Instead, she cataloged each artifact, each contradiction, each whispered name, and she followed the trail back to Carter Bridge, back to the river that had carried rumors for decades. Because in mysteries like these, the water always remembers. The river below Carter Bridge ran black at night, its current faster than it looked from the guardrails. In 1998, divers had been sent down with weighted lines, dogs worked the banks, and helicopters circled overhead. Yet nothing had surfaced. For years, that absence shaped the story. Mercer and Vega disappeared into water that consumed without giving back. But now the discovery of Unit 117 rewrote that belief. If the car had been buried, it wasn't the river that claimed them. It was human hands. Detective Sarah Collings stood again at the bridge one April morning, fog lifting in pale sheets. The asphalt bore scars from decades of weather, the paint almost erased. She leaned against the rail, hands tucked in her jacket, listening to the hum of trucks crossing in the distance. She tried to imagine Mercer and Vega that night, rain misting their uniforms, flashlights cutting arcs into the dark. What had they seen? Who had they met? Somewhere in that space between silence and static, their fates had shifted. Back at the county morgue, evidence from the recovered patrol car was laid out in rows. The LV flashlight, fragments of maps, and scraps of uniforms too waterlogged to identify. A single photograph had survived inside Mercer's wallet, though the image was nearly erased. A faint outline of two children blurred by dampness and time. Forensic technicians logged it anyway. Objects outlast memory, one of them said quietly to Collings, even when the details rot. She carried that phrase back to the files. Among brittle reports and half-faded Polaroids, Collings traced the original timeline. Mercer and Vega were dispatched at 1:52 a.m. to a sedan stalled near Carter Bridge. At 2:02 a.m., one of them purchased coffee at a diner off Highway 281, leaving behind the receipt that now sat sealed in evidence. At 2:14 a.m., their radio fell to static. By 2:40, a truck driver called in the abandoned sedan. And by 3:10, Responding deputies found the car empty, its hazard lights clicking against the fog. The patrol unit was gone. The deputies were gone. There was no record of the sedan's driver. No fingerprints were matched. The car itself vanished from inventory, as though it had never been towed. Collings frowned over the gaps. Records didn't simply vanish unless someone allowed it. She flipped to April's logs, the week after. That was when Sheriff Harland issued his containment order. His signature was scrawled across the bottom, shaky and rushed. The language was colder. Suspend operations. File unresolved. Divert resources. It did not read like a sheriff mourning two deputies. It read like someone closing a door. Collings requested an interview with Harland, now retired, and living 2 counties away. His home was a sagging ranch with weeds curling through the gravel drive. He met her at the porch, his frame stooped but his eyes still sharp. "I knew this would come back," he muttered, motioning her inside. The living room smelled of dust and old tobacco. On the mantel, framed photos of hunting trips and parades leaned at mismatched angles. "Why issue containment?" Collings asked. Notebook balanced on her knee. Harland's jaw tightened. "We were told to." "By whom?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze toward the dark television screen. "Calls came from higher up, state, maybe federal. They said drop it, said it was bigger than us. And I did what they told me." "Did you believe Mercer and Vega ran?" His voice cracked. Low. "No. I knew those boys. They wouldn't run. But I also knew asking questions could bury you just as quick as that river." He leaned forward, fingers trembling around the armrest. "You found that car, didn't you?" Collings nodded. Harland exhaled, a wheeze. "Then you already know. Somebody put it there. Somebody with enough pull to hide it for 25 years. Don't think they'll take kindly to you stirring it up again." She left with more silence than answers, but also with confirmation. Suppression had been deliberate. The next stop was the salvage yard tied to Charlie K.S. Rusting hulks towered in rows, their metal frames gnawed by weather. Collings walked between them, boots crunching glass, until she found the drum where Mercer's badge had been hidden. Investigators had already removed it, leaving only a circle in the dirt. The yard manager claimed ignorance, but his nervous glances told a different story. When she asked about Charlie K.S., his mouth thinned. "He's not here anymore." "Where is he?" A shrug. "Gone south. Always moving. Doesn't like to be found." Later that night, Collings parked outside her apartment and noticed an envelope tucked under her wiper blade. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in block letters. "Stop digging or end up with them." No signature, no fingerprints, just the smell of ink and rain. She read it twice, then folded it carefully into an evidence bag. Threats had a way of confirming direction. If someone wanted her to stop, it meant she was walking the right trail. She spread the artifacts across her desk again. Vega's flashlight, Mercer's badge, the diner receipt, the memo. Each object was a voice speaking from beneath 25 years of silence. Together, they whispered a pattern. What gnawed at her was not only what had been buried, but why? Why sink a patrol car? Why erase 2 deputies? Unless what they saw that night on Carter Bridge at 2:14 a.m. was never meant to be witnessed. Collings stared at the blurred photograph from Mercer's wallet, the faint outline of children's faces, 2 lives left, waiting for a father who never came home. She pressed her hand flat against the glass of the evidence sleeve. "Objects outlast memory," the forensic tech had said. Maybe, but sometimes memory claws its way back through objects. And sometimes the river itself remembers more than people want it to. That week, divers returned to Carter Bridge, this time with sonar and digital imaging. The river's surface looked calm, but beneath lay jagged channels and hidden shelves. On the third sweep, a shape appeared on the screen, a hollow outline half buried in silt. When divers surfaced with their find, Collings felt her breath catch. It was a torn fragment of fabric, blue and frayed, with a brass button still attached. Law enforcement issue. A scrap of a uniform, one that had no business being in the river unless Mercer or Vega had gone into it. The current carried secrets, but it also carried fragments back, and every fragment Collings touched seemed to pull her further into the same undertow that had taken 2 deputies in 1998. Only this time, she was determined not to let it close again. The fragment of uniform from the river was logged into evidence under new case files, its fibers tested against archived records. Results confirmed what Collings already suspected. The weave and dye matched the 1998 issue uniforms worn by deputies Mercer and Vega. But there was more. Embedded deep in the fabric was trace material of fine grit, consistent with quarry stone, not riverbed silt. The river had carried it downstream, but its true origin lay elsewhere. That finding shifted the search away from water. Collings traced property maps of the county and overlays of where quarries operated in the late 90s. One in particular stood out. An abandoned gravel pit 2 miles north of Carter Bridge closed the same year Mercer and Vega disappeared. Its land records showed a caretaker on file, Albert Garrison. The name was barely mentioned in the original investigation, noted once in a statement claiming he had seen nothing unusual that night. But Garrison had died in 2001, his cabin left to rot at the quarry's edge. Collings and her partner drove there at dusk, headlights bouncing across rutted dirt. The quarry sat like a hollowed wound in the earth, its pools slick with algae, cliffs scarred and pale. The caretaker's cabin leaned into the trees, roof caved on one side. They stepped inside with flashlights cutting across warped planks. The air smelled of rot and ash. Against one wall, gouges scarred the wood, scratches layered over time, some deep enough to splinter. Collings crouched, running gloved fingers across them. Letters emerged from the chaos. "I want Mom." Words scratched by a hand desperate enough to carve language into timber. The discovery unsettled both detectives. If Ethan Vega or Daniel Mercer had been kept here, who had held them? Garrison? Someone else using his cabin? The silence pressed heavier than the dark. They collected samples of the wood, photographed the markings, and bagged what remained of a child's shoe buried in dust near the bedframe. Blue canvas, size small, rubber sole cracked with age. Collings remembered the diner witness describing Mercer's son once waiting for his father to finish a late shift. Blue sneakers glowing under fluorescent light. The possibility gripped her. Was this shoe Ethan's? Or another child's entirely? Back at the precinct, Collings spread the evidence across her board. Mercer's badge from the salvage yard. Vega's flashlight from the buried car. The uniform was dredged from the river. Now the carved words, "I want Mom." Each artifact formed a trail not just of disappearance, but of captivity. She traced the timeline again. 1:52 dispatched, 2:02 receipt, 2:14 static, 2:40 sedan discovered. Between those minutes stretched a gap wide enough for abduction, confrontation, and burial. She requested access to recorded dispatch tapes from that night. Most had degraded, tape hiss swallowing words. But one section still pulsed with faint voices. At 2:13, Mercer's voice came through, strained, half-cut. "We've got static," swallowed the rest. Then Vega. "Hold on, there's again." Silence. The recording ended abruptly. The official transcript had labeled the section inaudible. Collings sat with headphones, looping it again and again. There were syllables, clipped but undeniable. A third voice. Low. One word. Almost clear. Contain. The word echoed the memo Harland had signed days later. Collings replayed it until the tape squealed. If contain had been spoken at Carter Bridge, then the order to shut down came not from the sheriff's office afterward, but from the scene itself. Someone was there that night. Someone with enough authority to command silence. News of the buried cruiser and the recovered evidence began leaking. Families of Mercer and Vega were approached by reporters. Vega's mother stood on her porch, tears shining in her eyes, telling cameras she never believed her son ran. Mercer's widow declined interviews, her silence heavier than words. The community, once numb, stirred again. Candlelight vigils reignited, this time tinged with anger rather than grief. Pressure mounted. The district attorney announced a review of the case, citing possible obstruction in the original investigation. Retired deputies were summoned for questioning. Some came willingly, others with clenched jaws. A pattern emerged of references to a man outside the department, one who handled problems no one wanted traced. Charlie K.S. He appeared in whispers, in half-formed stories about trucks that arrived at odd hours, about files that went missing after he visited the station. No one could say what K.S. stood for. No one wanted to. One evening, Collings sat in her apartment, case files spread across the table, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. The voice was distorted, filtered through static. "You're looking in the wrong place," it said. "Who is this?" Pause. "You won't find them in the river." The line went dead. Collings sat in silence, pulse hammering. The phrasing gnawed at her because she'd seen it before. In the original tip line logs from 1998, an anonymous caller had left the same warning: "Don't bother with the river." Now, 25 years later, the voice had returned. She didn't tell the press. Instead, she traced phone records, cross-checking towers and signals. The call had bounced from a prepaid device purchased in cash. No name, no trail. But the fact remained. Someone had been watching this case since 1998, close enough to repeat their words across decades. Collings confided in her partner the next morning. He frowned, sipping his coffee. "Same man, maybe. Or someone who wants you to believe it is. Either way, it means someone's still alive who knows exactly what happened that night." They returned to the diner, where Mercer and Vega had last been seen. The waitress remembered them well. Two deputies came in wet and looked rattled. They left in a hurry. One of them left behind a folded receipt. She hesitated, eyes dropping to her apron. They weren't alone. A man sat at the corner booth. Big shoulders, kept his hat low. He left right after they did. Collings leaned in. "Do you remember his face?" She shook her head. "No, but I remember his truck. Green, rust on the fender." The description pricked Collings's memory. In her stack of anonymous tips, one note had referenced a green truck idling near the quarry in the weeks after the deputies vanished. It was never followed up. She pulled the file again, tracing the handwriting. Blocky letters, deliberate. "Check closer to home. They're kept." That night, she drove back to the quarry alone, headlights slicing through mist. The caretaker's cabin loomed, its walls bearing the scars of scratched pleas. She stood in the doorway, listening to the silence. Then, from the back room, a sound, a creak, a shuffle. She raised her flashlight. The beam caught nothing but dust motes drifting. Yet when she turned back to leave, something new lay on the floor. A baseball card, edges frayed, placed carefully in the dirt. She lifted it with trembling hands. On the back, written in faded ink, "Still here." The baseball card lay sealed in evidence, its ink smudged but legible. "Still here." The handwriting was uneven, almost childlike. Collings stared at it long into the night. If the card had been left recently, it meant someone had entered the abandoned cabin knowing investigators would return. But if it had been left decades ago, preserved in silence, then the question was worse. Who had been there in the years after Mercer and Vega vanished? Forensic techs examined the card under light. No prints, no fresh fibers. The age-inconsistent ink, degraded, but the dirt on its back was too clean, as if disturbed recently. "Planted," one tech muttered. "Somebody wanted you to find this." Collings felt the weight of those words. Cases weren't just solved by evidence, they were shaped by those who placed it. Every artifact could be a breadcrumb or a trap. The next day she revisited the quarry in daylight. Sunlight made the scarred cliffs harsher, with weeds clawing through stone. The caretaker's shack looked smaller and less menacing, but its walls still bore the words carved decades ago, "I want Mom." She photographed each gouge, noting depth, layering, and overlapping hands. Some scratches seemed juvenile, others sharper and more deliberate. It felt less like a single message, and more like a diary written in wood. Outside the shack, her partner found tire impressions near the gate. Fresh, wide tread, consistent with a heavy truck. Collings crouched, fingertips tracing the mud. Whoever had left the baseball card hadn't simply wandered on foot. They had driven close, watched, and departed. That evening, Collings met with a retired Sergeant Carnes, one of the last to speak openly. His small house was cluttered with boxes, newspapers, and trophies from decades past. When she laid the baseball card on his table, his hand trembled. "I saw something like this once," he whispered. He described a locker search in 1998 and a hidden stash of trinkets, badges, scraps, and even a playing card. Sheriff Harland had ordered him to drop it and told him it wasn't relevant. Carnes obeyed, but the memory stuck. "We weren't chasing a disappearance," Carnes said. "We were stumbling through someone else's collection." Collings asked him about Charlie K.S. Carnes leaned back, face gray. That name got whispered when things went missing. Cars impounded but not logged. Guns turned up at crime scenes that had been sealed. K.S. was always behind the curtain. You didn't see him. You felt the shift when he passed through. Later that night, Collings sat in her car outside her apartment, the envelope threat still on her mind. Headlights flared in her rearview mirror, a truck idling behind her. Green paint, rust on the fender. Her breath caught. She turned the key, but the truck pulled away before she could follow, disappearing into side streets. The following morning, the DA's office summoned her. Files had been leaked. Copies of the containment memo, the excavation photos of Unit 117, and even transcripts of her private notes. Reporters were already calling. The DA's voice was sharp. "You want to keep digging? Fine. But do it knowing someone inside this system wants you exposed." Collings left with her resolve hardening. If silence had protected whoever orchestrated Mercer and Vega's disappearance, then sunlight might break it. She returned to her evidence board. The diner receipt, timestamp 22A. The memo, April 1. The flashlight with Vega's initials. The carved plea in the shack. The baseball card. Each a fragment of the same night. Each suggested Mercer and Vega had not run, but had been stopped, contained, and buried. That evening she visited Vega's mother. The old woman's house was small, with curtains drawn and photos crowding every surface. She held Collings's hands tightly, her voice thin. "Luis was proud to wear that badge. Don't let them tell you he ran. He wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't leave his sisters." She gestured toward a shelf where his flashlight once sat before the sheriff's office took it. That was his. He scratched his name into everything. Said he wanted proof it was his, even when he was gone. Tears welled in her eyes. "Now, it's all I have." Collings promised her she wouldn't stop. When she left, night had fallen. Fog curled low over the yards, and once again she noticed headlights in the distance. A truck, idling, watching. She turned quickly, but by the time she reached the intersection, it was gone. At the precinct, her partner found her staring at the map. "You're being followed," he said quietly. "I know. You think it's KS? I think whoever left that baseball card wants me to know they're close. Close enough to walk into my life, just like they walked into Mercer's and Vega's that night." The next break came from an unexpected angle. A construction worker near the river reported finding a steel container washed partially from the bank after heavy rain. Inside were uniforms, folded but decayed, soaked through with mud. One bore Mercer's name patch, another carried the faint outline of Vega's. But what unsettled Collings most wasn't the uniforms themselves. It was what else the drum contained. A small notebook, its pages warped but still legible. The entries were short, scrawled, and broken by water damage. Day 1, watching. Day 2, told not to speak. Day 5, I hear them outside. Day 8, we're buried. Day 9, don't let Mom know. The final legible line chilled Collings to her core. We didn't run, they buried us. The phrase matched the carving found inside the drum where Mercer's badge had been hidden. It wasn't random graffiti. It was a message Mercer or Vega had left behind, a record they had not gone willingly. Collings closed the notebook with trembling hands. Evidence was no longer just fragments. It was testimony, written in desperation, left to surface decades later. And whoever had silenced them once was still out there, watching the investigation now. That night, another envelope appeared under her wiper. This one held a photograph, blurred but clear enough. A shot of Collings herself, standing at Carter Bridge. Across the back, scrawled in ink, close enough. She stood under the streetlight, the photo trembling in her grip. Someone was weaving her into the same story that had swallowed Mercer and Vega. The line between investigator and prey had thinned to nothing. The photograph in her hand was still damp from the mist when Collings carried it into the precinct. She set it on the desk under harsh fluorescent light, its edges curling slightly. The image was undeniable, her own silhouette at Carter Bridge, timestamp burned into the corner. Whoever took it had stood less than 50 feet away. Her partner studied the photo and let out a low breath. They're letting you know they could have taken more than a picture. Collings nodded. It's a warning, and an invitation, he added. The photo's timing was deliberate. It had been left the same night the steel drum surfaced. A sequence, like someone orchestrating beats in a story only they knew the ending to. Collings pinned it to her board beside the carved message. We didn't run. They buried us. She returned to Carter Bridge that afternoon, standing on its rusted span as trucks rumbled across. The river below moved slow and brown, swollen with spring rain. She walked the length of the guardrail, trailing her fingers across the chipped paint. Halfway across, something caught her eye. Faint scratches etched into the steel. At first they looked like random weathering, but when she traced them, letters emerged. DM plus LV. Her throat tightened. Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega had carved their initials into the bridge. She photographed the marks, then sat in her car overlooking the water. A memory returned the old memo with the word containment. What if the bridge wasn't just symbolic, but literal? If Mercer and Vega had stopped here, carved their initials, and then disappeared, the bridge might be where they were taken. She requested a dive team. 3 days later, under gray skies, the divers lowered themselves into the murky river. Currents pulled against their lines, and silt clouded every movement. Hours passed before one surfaced, mask streaked with mud. He lifted a sodden object over the boat's edge, a torn shirt with a name patch still faintly visible. Mercer. Collings felt the breath leave her chest. Not proof of life, not proof of death, but proof they had reached this place. The divers continued. Late in the day, one called over the radio. We've got metal. Collings watched as chains strained and mud boiled up around a rising shape. Piece by piece, a rusted container broke the surface, water pouring from its seams. Inside, beneath layers of silt, were more fragments. A badge bent nearly in half, a service revolver encrusted with rust, and a flashlight, engraved with LV. The evidence confirmed Mercer and Vega had been submerged here. But why had the patrol car been buried miles away, while their personal effects sank under Carter Bridge? Back at headquarters, Collings reviewed photographs from the river. A pattern began to form. The buried cruiser had been planted to close the story. But the river cache of uniforms, badges, and flashlights spoke of something else. A deliberate disposal, separate from the official cover-up. Her partner leaned over the images. This wasn't about hiding them. This was about marking them. She asked what he meant. Artifacts in two different places, one for the record, one for whoever was meant to find it later. Like a ledger, truth on one side, a lie on the other. In Prosopode, that night, Collings couldn't shake the image of the initials carved into the bridge. It was an act of defiance, proof that Mercer and Vega had been there together, leaving a mark no memo could erase. Weeks later, she received an anonymous call. The voice was male, shaky, and distorted by poor reception. "You're not wrong," the caller said. "Who is this?" "They put them in the ground, but not before the bridge." The line went dead. Collings traced the call to a decommissioned payphone outside an old diner 2 counties over. She drove there the next morning. The diner sat abandoned, its windows boarded, the parking lot cracked with weeds. On the counter inside lay a folded piece of paper, weighted by a coffee mug. She unfolded it carefully. A map, hand-drawn, with roads marked in black and a single red X circled 3 times. Next to it, written in the same jagged hand as the baseball card, "Follow the chain." Collings studied the map under fading daylight. The red X corresponded to a farmhouse on county land long sold at auction. She drove there that evening, headlights cutting through fields of overgrown grass. The house leaned under its own weight, shutters banging in the wind. Inside, dust choked the air. Furniture lay collapsed, paint peeled in sheets, but the floorboards near the back wall looked newer. She pried them open, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside were photographs wrapped in wax paper. The images were blurred and black and white, but the subjects were unmistakable. 2 men in uniform kneeling beside a shallow trench. One looked like Sheriff Harland in his younger years. Behind them, a patrol car, partially covered in dirt. Collings's pulse hammered. The buried cruiser had not been moved there by chance. It had been interred under supervision. The final photo was the worst. It showed a message scrawled on cardboard, propped against the trench. "Paper is truth." Collings sat on the floor, photographs trembling in her hands. Whoever had orchestrated the burial had treated it as a ritual, not just containment, but ceremony. When she left the farmhouse, night had fallen. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke, though no fire burned. As she reached her car, headlights flared in the distance from a truck idling at the far end of the road. She froze, gripping the folder tight. The truck lingered, then eased backward into the dark, swallowed by the fields. Back at her apartment, Collings spread the photographs across her table. The words echoed, "Paper is truth." The memo, the receipts, the artifacts, and even the photographs themselves are all pieces of a ledger, kept by someone who believed the act of recording conferred reality. But for Mercer and Vega, paper had not been enough. Their truth had been buried with them. Collings leaned back, exhaustion pressing into her bones. She knew then the investigation was not simply about unearthing the past. It was about confronting those still alive, who had chosen silence as their shield. And silence, she realized, was beginning to crack. The photographs from the farmhouse sat under a single lamp on Collings's desk, their edges curling as if recoiling from light. The phrase scrawled on cardboard haunted her, "Paper is truth." Whoever had written it believed that documentation carried more weight than testimony, more permanence than memory. Yet Mercer and Vega's story had been reduced to neither paper nor truth, but silence. Collings drove back to the courthouse archives, chasing a thin lead. The property records for the farmhouse revealed a paper trail that stopped abruptly in 1999, transferred from a shell corporation to county holding, then scrubbed. No buyer, no seller, just a gap. She asked the clerk why. He shrugged. Files were sealed by the sheriff's office. Not unusual for forfeitures back then, but it was unusual. Sheriff Harlan's signature appeared on the bottom of the form, his initials scrawled over the word containment. Later that week, Collings tracked down a former deputy who had served under Harlan in 1998. His name was Eric Danner, and he lived alone in a small trailer outside Odessa. Danner was gray now, His shoulders stooped, but his eyes darted like a man still expecting knocks at the door. "I can't talk about them," he said when she mentioned Mercer and Vega. "You already are," Collings replied. Danner's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. "They didn't run. You know that, right?" "I do." "Then you also know why I can't say more. People disappeared for asking less." Collings slid one of the farmhouse photographs across his table. The image of Sheriff Harland kneeling by the trench. Danner froze. His cigarette burned down to ash. "I wasn't supposed to see this," he whispered. "None of us were. Harland told us they'd been transferred, that it was out of our hands. But I saw the cruiser go into the ground. I saw KS standing there. He had his hands in his pockets, like it was nothing, like he was burying trash." "K's?" "Charlie. That's all we ever called him. Fixer. He ran the salvage yard. Harland would send impounds there, and they'd never come back. You didn't ask questions. But when I saw him at that trench, I knew it wasn't about cars. It was about people." Collings leaned forward. "Where is KS now?" Danner shook his head. "You don't find KS. He finds you." When Collings left, she noticed a truck parked 2 lots down. Same wide tires, same slow idle. She turned down a side road, watching in her mirror. The truck followed for 3 miles before vanishing into a field. That night, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She answered, silence on the line. Then a voice, calm and unhurried. "You're carrying photographs that don't belong to you." Collings gripped the receiver. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. Return them, and you can keep your badge. Keep them, and you'll keep digging your own grave." The call ended. She replayed the voice in her mind. It didn't sound like Harland. It didn't sound like Danner. It was someone who had been watching from closer than she realized. The next morning, Collings filed a sealed copy of the farmhouse photographs with the state police. She knew the risk. Once the chain of custody widened, so did the leaks. But she needed redundancy. If someone came for her, the evidence had to outlive her. Her partner pulled her aside later that day. "We've got something from forensics. That notebook in the steel drum wasn't written by one hand. 2 sets of pressure, 2 different pen strokes. Mercer and Vega both wrote in it." Collings studied the report. The alternating lines suggested a dialogue. One entry is shaky and rushed. "They told us not to speak." The next, steadier. "We're buried." It wasn't just a record. It was a conversation trapped on paper. She read the final line again. "We didn't run. They buried us." A statement of truth meant to outlast their voices. That evening, she drove to Vega's mother's house to deliver the update. The old woman opened the door with red-rimmed eyes. "I've been waiting 25 years for someone to tell me what I already knew," she said quietly. Collings handed her a photocopy of the notebook page. Tears welled as her fingers traced the words. "He wanted me to know," she whispered. "He wanted someone to remember." Collings stayed for tea, the house heavy with photographs and silence. When she left, the sky was dark, clouds pressing low. She noticed a folded envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside was another photograph. This one showed a rusted gate at the edge of town, scrawled across the back, "Next chain." The gate led to the salvage yard. She drove there the following morning. The yard stretched for acres, rusted vehicles stacked like monuments to neglect. At the entrance, a faded sign swung in the wind, its letters peeling. KS Salvage. The padlock on the gate was old but intact, yet the ground beneath was disturbed, as though trucks had entered recently. Collings stepped inside. Rows of crushed cars loomed over her, metal carcasses with shattered windshields and torn doors. She moved slowly, camera clicking, noting VIN numbers stripped clean. At the far end, she found a warehouse. Its walls were corrugated steel, its windows blacked out. Inside smelled of oil and mildew. Shelves held boxes of files, each marked with dates and numbers. She opened one. Inside were badges, dozens of them, tarnished and bent. Another box held uniforms, some shredded, some intact. At the bottom of a third box lay a stack of photographs, each showing a vehicle buried nose first into dirt. Her stomach turned. This was KS's collection, a ledger of erasure. Footsteps echoed behind her. Callings froze. A man's voice cut the silence. "You shouldn't be here." She turned slowly. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands in his pockets. TS. He stepped forward, his face shadowed. "You think you're solving something. You're not. You're trespassing in a cemetery I built." Callings steadied her voice. "Mercer and Vega didn't run. You buried them." KS tilted his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Paper is truth. And the paper says they vanished. That's all anyone will ever believe." She raised her camera, snapping a photo before he could move. The shudder echoed in the cavernous warehouse. KS's smile faded. "You'll regret that," he said, and stepped back into the light. By the time she reached the door, the yard was empty. KS was gone, as though he had dissolved into the rusted rose. Callings clutched her camera. She had a photograph of the man himself now. Proof he was not a ghost, but flesh. Proof that Mercer and Vega's erasure had a hand, a name, and a face. But proof, she realized, was not safety. It was a target. The photograph of KS developed into something sharper than Callings expected. In the grainy light of the salvage yard doorway, his features were just discernible. Weathered skin, cropped hair, and the weight of a man who had lived in shadow long enough to grow comfortable there. She printed 3 copies, sealing one in evidence, hiding another at home, and keeping the third folded inside her notebook. The next morning, she drove to the DA's office, intent on handing it over. But when she entered the lobby, the receptionist looked up with guarded eyes. "Your meeting's been canceled," she said. "By whom?" "Internal Affairs filed a complaint. You're under review." Callings felt her stomach knot. IA complaints didn't just appear. They were pushed, leveraged, and timed. KS had spoken less than a day ago, and now her credibility was under siege. She left without arguing, pulling into a nearby lot to collect her thoughts. Her phone buzzed. A message with no sender. "Your file is open. Drop it." Callings stared at the words until they blurred. Someone inside the system had triggered the review. Someone close. That night, she drove back to Carter Bridge, needing the quiet rush of water to think. Fog pooled along the guardrail, headlights sweeping the mist. She stood where Mercer and Vega had carved their initials, fingertips brushing the grooves. A vow, frozen in steel. A sound broke the stillness. Footsteps. She turned. KS stood 10 feet away, hands in his pockets, just as he had in the photograph. The fog swirled around him, blurring edges but not intent. "You're persistent," he said. His voice was calm and steady. "So were they," she replied, nodding toward the initials. KS stepped closer. "You think the bridge matters? The cruiser? The drum in the river? Those were chapters written to be found. That's how you keep control. You feed the story. Enough for people to chase, not enough to touch the truth." "What truth?" Callings demanded. KS's eyes lingered on her camera, hanging from her shoulder. "The truth is that Mercer and Vega were never yours to solve. They belong to a ledger older than your badge." A truck rumbled over the bridge, headlights flooding the span. When the beams passed, KS was gone, swallowed by fog. Callings stood trembling, the initials cold under her hand. He had walked away not because she was safe, but because he chose to. The following morning, she met her partner at the precinct. "We have to push this higher," she said. "State or federal. We're boxed in here." He hesitated. "You push it higher, you lose it. They'll seize the files and bury them again. IA will finish the job." Callings slammed the notebook on the desk, the photograph of KS sliding free. Then what? Pretend Mercer and Vega ran off into the night? Pretend this doesn't exist? He stared at the photograph, jaw tight. "You don't get it. The moment you put this face into the system, he'll vanish again, and so will you. That night, Collings returned home to find her door ajar. She drew her weapon, moving cautiously inside. The apartment was quiet, but drawers hung open, papers scattered. On her desk sat the folded photograph of KS. The one she had hidden at home now lay neatly in the center. Across it, scrawled in thick black ink, "Last chance." Her pulse hammered. He had been inside her home, touched her things, and left without taking anything but her sense of safety. She didn't sleep. By dawn, she decided silence was no longer an option. She scheduled an interview with a local journalist she trusted, a woman who had covered corruption cases for years. They met in a diner off Highway 281. Collings slid the notebook across the table. "This doesn't leave your hands until I say, but if anything happens to me, you publish it." The journalist's eyes widened at the contents of the farmhouse photographs, the river evidence, and the image of KS. "This is enough to burn half the county," she whispered. "That's the point," Collings said. When Collings left the diner, a black sedan idled across the lot. She didn't recognize the driver, but the timing was deliberate. As she pulled onto the highway, the sedan followed. Mile after mile, it trailed her, headlights steady in her mirror. Near Carter Bridge, it pulled alongside. The window lowered. KS sat in the passenger seat, expression unreadable. He tapped 2 fingers against the glass, a gesture half casual, half warning. Then the sedan slowed, turned, and disappeared down a dirt road. Collings gripped the wheel, breath ragged. He wanted her to know she was always within reach. Later that night, her partner called. His voice was strained. "You need to lay low. They're building a case to suspend you. IA says you mishandled evidence and crossed lines. They'll make it stick." Collings stared at her board, Mercer and Vega's faces staring back from yellowed clippings. "If they suspend me, they suspend the case. That's what KS wants." "Then you need another move," her partner said. Collings's eyes fell to the notebook again. The last line in Mercer's handwriting, "We didn't run. They buried us." It wasn't just testimony. It was instruction. Don't let them bury the truth again. She packed the files into a weathered satchel, locking her apartment behind her. If the system was compromised, then the story had to live outside it. She thought of the journalist, the photographs, the baseball card, and the ledger of artifacts. If paper was truth, then paper needed to spread. At midnight, she drove toward the bridge once more. Rain slicked the pavement, wipers smearing streaks across her windshield. As she approached the span, headlights bloomed in her mirror. The same black sedan, closing fast. Collings pressed the accelerator. The sedan matched her speed, edging closer. Rain hammered, tires hissed, and engines roared across steel. Then, just as suddenly, the sedan braked, falling back into the fog. Collings pulled to the shoulder, heart racing. She stepped out, rain soaking her hair, headlights casting her shadow long across the guardrail. She stood where the initials had been carved, hand against cold steel. Somewhere in the mist, an engine idled, watching, waiting. The line between hunter and hunted was gone. The storm broke over the county that night, lightning spidering across the horizon as Collings drove with the satchel of evidence in her passenger seat. Each flash illuminated road signs, wet asphalt, and the blur of her own reflection in the window. She wasn't heading home. She couldn't. The black sedan had proven that much. She aimed instead for the journalist's office downtown, a brick building tucked behind an empty laundromat. When she arrived, the newsroom was dim, with only a desk lamp burning in the back. The journalist, Emma Rains, looked up as Collings entered dripping rain. "You brought it?" Collings laid the satchel on the desk, spreading photographs, notes, and artifacts. "If something happens to me, you release all of it. Names, dates, faces. Don't hold back." Emma scanned the farmhouse photos, her lips tightening. "This is organized, not just a cover-up, a system. Whoever KS is, he's not working alone." Collings nodded. "He's the hinge. the hand that moved everything into the ground. They worked for hours, cataloging, cross-referencing, and building a timeline that bled from 1998 to the present. The more they laid it out, the more it looked like a ledger, a record of containment and silence carried across decades. Emma leaned back, rubbing her eyes. If this goes public, it'll tear the sheriff's office apart. Maybe the DA's office too. But you know what happens then? They'll come for us both. Before Collins could answer, the power flickered. The lamp died. Computers hummed into silence. Outside, headlights swept across the window, lingering. Emma moved to the blinds, peeking through. They're here. Collins grabbed the satchel, stuffing evidence back inside. We go out the back. They slipped into the alley, rain pounding on the tin awnings overhead. A figure moved at the mouth of the alley, a broad-shouldered man with hands in his pockets. K.S. Collins froze. The distance between them was short enough to measure in heartbeats. He stepped forward, rain slicking his hair flat, his eyes locked on hers. "You think you've built a case," he said, voice calm even under the thunder. "What you've built is a noose, and you're the one wearing it." Emma's breath hitched, clutching the satchel tighter. Collins positioned herself between them, her voice steady. "You buried 2 deputies. You think silence will last forever?" KS's lips curled faintly. "Forever isn't necessary. Just longer than you breathe." A crash of thunder masked his retreat. When the lightning flashed again, the alley was empty. Only the echo of his footsteps remained. Collins and Emma didn't linger. They drove the evidence to a secure lockbox at the newspaper's sister office across state lines. By dawn, copies of the files sat in 2 locations beyond KS's reach. For the first time, Collins felt a measure of relief. The story was no longer hers alone to guard. But relief came with consequence. By afternoon, her suspension was official. IA investigators arrived at her precinct desk, removing her badge and sidearm. Her partner caught her eye as they led her out, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. "They'll make this stick," he whispered. Collins nodded, holding her head high. The system had turned against her, but the truth was already seated elsewhere. That night, she returned once more to Carter Bridge. Rain had passed, leaving the river swollen and restless. She stood at the carved initials, the roar of water below filling the silence. She whispered their names, Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, and promised aloud that their story would not be erased again. A voice answered from the shadows. "You've already lost." She spun, flashlight beams slicing the dark. KS leaned against the guardrail, expression unreadable. "Evidence doesn't matter when no one listens. They'll smear you, suspend you, and discredit everything. And when the papers run the story, people will shrug. 2 deputies, a buried car, a rumor. That's all they'll see." Collins steadied her voice. "Not this time. Not with photographs. Not with paper." KS pushed off the rail, stepping closer. "Paper burns." For a moment, the only sound was the river's relentless churn. Then headlights flared from the highway. KS turned, melting into the shadows once again. Collins's hands shook, but she stood her ground until the night went still. The next morning, Emma called. "We've got traction. State investigators contacted me. They've seen the photos. They're opening an inquiry into Harland and his deputies. It's happening." Collins allowed herself a breath, but unease lingered. KS would not fade simply because papers were filed. He thrived in silence, but he could also adapt to noise. Her instincts were confirmed hours later when a message appeared on her windshield, scrawled across a torn ledger page. "Meet me where the road splits. Midnight. Or the next body they bury will be yours." The road splits. Collins knew the place. An old fork where Highway 281 diverged into a rural bypass. It was isolated, unlit, and forgotten except by those who needed space unseen. Her partner begged her not to go. "It's a trap." "I know," she said. "But if he's calling me out, it means he's slipping. This may be the only chance we get." Midnight. arrived with fog, curling low over the asphalt. Collings parked beneath a dead billboard, her headlights off. The black sedan appeared minutes later, its beams cutting across the fork. KS stepped out, hands empty, posture casual. "You brought your courage," he said, his voice carrying in the still night. Collings stood tall, the notebook clutched in her hand. "And you brought your arrogance." KS smiled faintly. "Arrogance is for men who think they're alive forever. I don't. I just know how to keep the paper clean." He stepped closer, and for the first time, Collings saw a flicker of weariness, perhaps, or the shadow of conscience. But then his eyes hardened again. "You want the truth? The truth is, they saw what wasn't meant to be seen. That's all. Wrong place, wrong time. And me? I'm the man who makes wrong times disappear." Lightning flared, thunder rolled, and in that instant, Collings realized the confrontation was inevitable. KS was not just a man. He was a ledger, written in flesh, carrying the silence of decades. And tonight, that silence was breaking. Fog thickened around the fork, muting the sound of insects and the far-off rush of the river. Collings kept her stance steady, every nerve sparking. KS circled slowly, boots crunching gravel, his eyes locked on her like a predator assessing distance. "You could have walked away," he said. "Plenty of deputies have. They learn the rule. Don't scratch beneath the paper. The paper holds the truth. You tear it, you're gone." Collings raised the notebook, the very ledger page he'd once used to taunt her. "You buried them under paper, but the ground gave them back. People know now. That won't stop." KS's lip curled into the faintest smile. "People don't want the truth. They want stories that end neatly, tragedies that fit in a headline. Do you think they'll remember Mercer and Vega a month from now? No. They'll forget, like they forgot before." "Not this time," Collings said, her voice steel. "Not with photographs. Not with the farmhouse chamber. Not with you." Something flickered in his eyes, the faintest ripple of unease. He stepped closer, the fog parting around his silhouette. "You don't get it. I'm not a man you can arrest. I'm on a roll. Take me away. Another fills it. Silence is always hired." Collings tightened her jaw. "Then tonight, it ends with you." Headlights swept suddenly across the fork. Tires crunched to a halt. Vega's SUV rolled up slowly, his door swinging open. "Sarah," he called, weapon drawn but low. KS tilted his head, almost amused. "Back up? Smart. But it won't matter." From the shadow of the trees, another figure moved. A shot cracked, sparks jumping from the asphalt near Vega's feet. Collings dropped to a crouch, heart hammering. KS didn't flinch. He simply stepped back, letting the second figure, a gaunt man with a rifle, advance into the open. "Always 2 moves ahead," KS said softly. "That's why I'm still here." The rifleman's face came clear in the haze. Jason Carnes, an old deputy once dismissed for misconduct, whispered about but never charged. Collings remembered his name from the files. A man who had run errands for Harland. A man who vanished when the patrol car did. "Thought you died," she muttered. Carnes grinned, teeth bared. "Sometimes dead men do better work." Vega shouted from behind cover. "Drop it, Carnes! This doesn't end your way!" Carnes leveled the rifle. "It ends the only way it can. Clean." Collings's pulse roared. Time slowed the fog, the glare of headlights, and the cold ledger page in her hand. She stepped forward, raising her voice above the storm that threatened to break again. "You killed them," she said, eyes locked on KS. "Not the river, not fate. You. And now you hide behind ghosts." KS's expression flickered, almost a crack in the mask. They weren't saints. They saw too much. "They were deputies," Collings shot back. "They swore to protect, and you silenced them for doing their job." For the first time, KS hesitated. Carnes's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Vega fired. A clean shot, sharp and precise. Carnes dropped to his knees, the rifle clattering across wet asphalt. His groan echoed in the fog as Vega advanced, weapons still trained. KS didn't move. He looked at Carnes, then at Collings, his eyes hollow. One ghost falls, another rises. It was a fright. Collings took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. Not this time. Tonight, the ground keeps what you buried. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing. Backup was on the way. For the first time, KS seemed to weigh the moment. His hand flexed at his side, then slowly rose into the mist. "You think chains will hold me?" he asked quietly. "They don't have to," Collings said. "Paper does. And this time, it's ours." When state investigators arrived, KS was taken without a struggle. Carnes lay on the asphalt, bleeding but alive, muttering fragments about keeping the files clean. Evidence, alive and undeniable. By dawn, the fork in the road was littered with cones and bagged casings and photos snapped under floodlights. Collings sat on the hood of her car, soaked and silent, watching as KS was loaded into the back of a cruiser. His eyes met hers once, unreadable, before the door slammed shut. Vega approached, exhaustion etched into his face. "We got him," he said, almost in disbelief. Collings nodded, though relief didn't come. The fog was thinning, the sky paling toward morning. But her chest felt heavier, not lighter. She thought of Mercer and Vega's families, the decades of silence, the farmhouse chamber, and the carved words, "We didn't run. They buried us." They had dug the truth out. But at what cost? Emma Raines appeared on the roadside, camera slung at her side. She didn't speak, just gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's in the world now. No one can erase it." Still, Collings knew KS's words weren't empty. Silence could always be bought again, hired again. And though one ghost had been dragged into the light, shadows still lingered on the edges of Carter Bridge, waiting. As daylight broke, the river below churned restlessly, carrying secrets it would never surrender. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps, a place where truth often arrived too late. Cameras lined the railings, cables tangled across stone, and microphones clustered like flowers forced from soil. District Attorney Monroe stood at the podium, flanked by state investigators, her voice steady as she read the charges: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and homicide. The name Charlie KS rang out at last, carried on airwaves after decades of being spoken only in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, flashbulbs burst against the gray sky, and for a moment, the silence that had held this case hostage fractured wide. Families of Mercer and Vega stood together on the front row. Mercer's widow, her hair now streaked with silver, clutched a framed photograph of her husband in uniform. Vega's mother held her son's badge to her chest, fingers trembling. Neither smiled nor wept. They simply watched as the world acknowledged what they had always known. Their sons had not run. They had been buried. Detective Sarah Collings lingered at the edge of the crowd, coat collar turned up against a cold breeze. She felt the weight of every artifact she'd touched. The flashlight, the ledger, the carved wall. They had all led here, to this moment of reckoning. Yet as Monroe's voice declared justice served, Collings felt the hollowness beneath the words. She knew justice was never that simple. After the conference, she walked down the courthouse steps. Reporters pressed forward, questions flying. "Detective, is this the end of the case? Do you believe KS acted alone?" Collings said nothing. She slipped into the quiet of a side street, boots echoing on damp pavement. Some truths couldn't be handed out like headlines. That night, she drove back to Carter Bridge. Fog curled along the river, just as it had the night Mercer and Vega vanished. The guardrails were rusted, patched in places with fresh bolts after years of wear. Bouquets leaned against them, new flowers laid by strangers who had followed the story on screens, who came to stand where silence once ruled. Collings parked and walked to the midpoint, resting her palms against cold metal. She closed her eyes and heard the static of the dashcam, the last 38 seconds that had carried across decades. We didn't run. They buried us. The words replayed in her mind, heavier now that the car was unearthed, heavier now that KS sat in a cell. She whispered into the fog, "We dug you back out." The river below roared its endless reply. Weeks later, the farmhouse chamber was sealed off. Forensic teams scraped every inch, catalogued every carving, and measured every scratch. The wall that bore the deputy's message was cut free and delivered to evidence storage, though Collings thought it belonged somewhere else, somewhere public, somewhere people couldn't look away. But bureaucracy had its own rules. In town, the mood shifted. For years, Ridgetop had lived under the weight of rumor and suspicion. Now coffee shops buzzed with conversation, church gatherings lingered on the news, and people who had once whispered leaned into each other openly. Some voices condemned Sheriff Harlan's legacy. Others muttered that dragging it all up had done more harm than good. Small towns rarely agreed on how to handle truth, but no one ignored it anymore. Vega's mother visited the precinct one evening, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She placed her son's badge on Collings's desk and said simply, "Thank you for giving him back." Collings started to answer, but the woman shook her head. "Not his body, his name. That's enough." She turned and left before Collings could speak again. Collings carried those words home that night, heavier than any file she'd lifted. She poured whiskey into a chipped glass, sat by her window, and stared at the courthouse clock glowing in the distance. She thought of KS in his cell, perhaps smiling even now, believing his role would be refilled by another. She thought of Carnes bleeding on the fork, muttering about clean files. And she thought of the ledger page she still kept in a sealed folder, the one marked with faint lines that didn't match KS's hand. The thought lodged like a splinter. Someone else had written those warnings. Someone else had circled the sheriff's office with silence. KS had been the face, but was he the only one? Collings didn't say it aloud. She let the city hum fill the room and let the glass sweat in her hand. Justice was never neat. She had learned that long ago. But she also knew silence had cracks now, cracks too wide to close. On the anniversary, the community gathered at Carter Bridge. Candles flickered against the guardrail. Photographs lined the concrete, and names were spoken aloud. Daniel Mercer, Luis Vega. The river hissed below, indifferent yet eternal, carrying their memory downstream. Collings stood among them, candlelight painting her face, her shadow stretching across asphalt. She felt the crowd's breath as one, a ritual to counter silence. When the ceremony ended, she lingered. The fog thinned, the sky bruised with early dawn. A single scrap of paper clung to the guardrail, taped by someone unseen. She peeled it free. On it, written in block letters, "Not all buried things stay gone." Collings folded the paper carefully, slipping it into her coat pocket. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Some shadows were always watching. She turned back toward her car, the candle's glow still flickering in her hands, her breath steady against the chill. For now, the story had an ending. But endings were fragile. And in places like this, on roads where headlights fade into fog, stories always wait for someone willing to listen. So, if you're drawn to mysteries that resist closure, to voices pulled out of silence after decades underground, subscribe. Because there will always be more shadows to follow, more bridges to cross, and more names waiting to be spoken aloud.